Hi, everyone. It's Michelle Massey with Operation Parent. It's my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to our webinar with Dr. Danielle Dick. We're so thankful that you're joining us and just wanted to take a minute and let you know you're in the right place and you are in for a treat this afternoon. If you're brand new to us, a couple of technical things. In 24 hours, you are going to get a recording of the webinar, certificate of attendance, and a link to the survey will pop to you immediately following the close of the webinar if you are here with us live. So we've got you covered. You're going to get all of those things from us here in just a little bit. We also ask you to keep an eye on our website. We have free monthly webinars with experts, and we are expecting to have one up for you in April. We just don't have the details hammered out yet. So please keep an eye on the website and know that you'll get some additional information from us about signing up here very shortly. At Operation Parent, our mission is to love and support parents by providing real-world information, connection, and most importantly, hope. And with that being said, I'm going to talk you through the technical ways to participate and join us this afternoon in the webinar. You are going to see an orange arrow at the top of your screen. If you tap on that arrow, you're going to see all the features in your control panel. So this is if you are on a desktop. If you are listening from your phone or a tablet or something, it might be a little bit different, but you will still hopefully have a similar experience. Our question feature is a little bit down the control panel, in the middle of the control panel, and you're going to put both your questions, your comments, everything participation wise is going to come to us through that question section today. We've got some awesome handouts lined up for you. Dr. Danielle's group has put together 4 handouts, and they are all available in English as well as Spanish. There are 5 ways children's genes shape their behavior is the title of one of your handouts. A radical way to help kids avoid substance use. That is music to all of our ears and an awesome handout. There are some additional resources on a third handout. And then lastly, what every parent needs to know about teen substance use. So please dig into those handouts. You can download them right here with us while we're live. You also received an email. If you were registered last evening, you would have received an email with the handouts included there as well. So just make sure you check the email that you registered with us initially, and you should have handouts in your emails, or you can download them here with us if that's convenient for you to do so. Want to let you know that there's a question and answer section at the end, which is our usually most favorite part, to have an opportunity to ask a question directly to Dr. Danielle Dick, who is an expert in substance use prevention. So stay with us till the very end. We have that special question and answer section, as well as we are going to be giving away 2 copies of her book today. Again, wanted to remind you that we are recording this presentation in case you are just coming in the queue. We are recording this presentation. It's going to be sent in a follow-up email 24 hours after completion of this webinar. So just again, please check the email that you registered with for the webinar originally. There's going to be a really quick, short survey directly after the webinar. It's just going to take about 2 minutes to complete, and your continued support, encouragement, and feedback through that instrument really does help keep us going, and we utilize every single word on that, and we greatly appreciate not only that you've chosen to spend your afternoon with us, because we know your time is really valuable, but that you also give us the gift of some feedback and guidance on that survey as well. We love getting that. And Now I'm really excited to get going with the afternoon. For those of you that are back, if you had the opportunity to see Dr. Danielle Dick's first webinar and you're back for the second one, you already know a little bit about her. But for those of you that are new, I want to make sure that you know that she leads the university-wide Rutgers Addiction Research Center with the Brain Health Institute. She is a genetics expert, and she is the author of The Child Code, which is a book that I cannot recommend enough. That book was so good. I read it, and then I also was able to utilize Audible and go through it one more time. There's so many things that I wish I had known earlier in raising my daughters, but I'm super glad to know now, and I hope you will as well. So she's going to tell us a lot more about the book, but I'm telling you, it changed the way that I think about parenting. If you're like me, in our house, we have two daughters that are completely different in their personalities, dispositions, their traits. And so this gave me lots of fun memories and things about growing up and signs along the way of you know, what might be genes and what might be their dispositions and things like that. It's a fascinating book, and it's so well written. So I encourage you to take a look at it. What I also want you to know is that she has been cited in 400 peer-reviewed publications focusing on mental health, addiction, and genetics. She is one of the most cited researchers in the world. And you know, I'm honored to introduce you to her, but I also want you to know she is a mom herself, and she is reframing the way that we look at substance use prevention. And I just couldn't be more thankful to know her and that she's offering her time here with us today.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, Michelle. And
Sure.
I want to check first that everything looks good from your end.
Looks excellent. Right on track.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all for spending part of your afternoon here with me. It's a pleasure to be back with Operation Parent. And today I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, in the sense that, as Michelle mentioned, my background and training is across psychology and genetics. And a lot of my work is studying children into adolescence and emerging adulthood, and trying to understand how kids' genes and their environments come together to impact what kids are most at risk. And I'm also a parent, as Michelle said, and so I became very interested in how can we use this information in our parenting and to help understand our own children so that we can help them avoid problems and have the best outcomes for them. So one of the things that I find fascinating about raising kids is that even with a PhD, even as a considered expert in this area, we have done amazing things over the course of history. We have been raising tiny people for hundreds of thousands of years and growing them into adults, and yet parenting can still feel so challenging for every one of us. Doesn't matter what letters you have behind your name. It's fascinating to me that we can have done things like put someone on the moon, created devices that you can essentially stay in touch with people on the other side of the world or have the world's information at your fingertips. And yet, whether we're talking about toddlers or teenagers, they can still be so challenging to raise. And in fact, one of the things that I find really interesting, and that ultimately led me to write my book, is that it's not that there's a lack of information about raising kids out there. We're a culture that's literally obsessed with parenting. You know, there's parenting books and blogs and magazines. And so one of the things that I really think a lot about is, with so much information out there, why can parenting still feel so challenging and so nerve-wracking, essentially? That sometimes it feels like the more experience you have with kids, the less you feel like you know. So if we were all together in a room, I would ask you all, what you think the single biggest factor affecting kids' behavior is. So if you're trying to predict which kids are going to have substance use challenges or other behavioral challenges, what do you think some of the biggest risk factors are? What would you pick as maybe the biggest thing that's going to predict which kids are going to develop problems? And I find that parents will often say things like, oh, well, it's having neglectful or uninvolved parents. Of course, those are things that are risk factors, but it's not the biggest one. Or they'll maybe say, oh, it's their peers. Peers have a big influence in adolescence. That's in fact very true, but not the biggest one. Or sometimes people will say, oh, well, it's schools or neighborhoods, it's social determinants of health, it's challenging circumstances. All of those things are absolutely true, but it's not the biggest one. In fact, the biggest predictor, the biggest thing that affects kids' behavior is our kids themselves. And here's what I mean by that. All of our kids are born with a unique genetic code, a disposition that influences everything from their propensity toward impulsivity, self-regulation, fear, frustration, anxiety, addiction, sociability, and extroversion. In fact, it doesn't matter what behavior you study, on average, about 50% of the differences in kids' behavior is due to differences in their DNA sequence. So it's about 50% of the differences in which kids are more impulsive than other kids when they're younger, which kids are more anxious than other kids, and which kids are more likely to be using substances in risky ways than other kids. Now, very often, this is the point where parents, have these big wide eyes and will be looking at me thinking, well, this is not helpful. What am I supposed to do with this information? You're actually telling me I have less control as a parent? But I think this information is very important for us to have as parents. And in fact, it was when I became a parent and I started looking around at what the parenting information that was out there was telling us, the kind of messages we get from so much of that parenting advice that's out there, much of which is great, but it is very often ignoring this big thing that we know influences kids' behavior, which is their genetic makeup. And the reason I think that that's problematic for us as parents to not be talking about is there's two big reasons that I think it can make our parenting harder than it has to be. The first one is, oh, looks like I've gone backwards here, excuse me. The first reason is what I call the parenting myth. And this is the idea that by failing to take into account kids' genetic dispositions, we have convinced ourselves that if we are just good enough parents, we are going to be able to parent our kids right into that Ivy League school or that Nobel Prize. Unfortunately, there's nothing from developmental psychology that suggests that we have that much control over our kids' outcomes. And the other piece is that when we double down on parenting, it really comes at a high cost. It places a ton of pressure on us as parents, who we feel like if, goodness forbid, our kids are struggling, we must be doing something wrong. We need to read more books or be more attuned to our children, or we should have done something differently. It also places a ton of pressure on our children, who can feel the weight of our expectations for them. And if we're honest, I think it also contributes to what can sometimes feel like a culture of judgment surrounding parenting. And I'm willing to bet that we've all probably done it. I will admit I have, which is, we've looked at either the toddler throwing a temper tantrum at Target or that teenager who is back talking to their parent. And we look from that child to that parent and we judge. We think, oh, that parent really needs to, fill in whatever your favorite parenting advice is here. But as any of us who have had challenging small children or teenagers know, very often we're trying to do everything we can. We're collecting more information and reading more books than anybody, and we only have so much that we can do. And so that extra judgment we might get from other people isn't helpful. Those are the people that need our support, not our judgment. So I think that's the first problem with ignoring the role that our kids' genes play on their outcomes. The second reason I think that it's a problem is that it misses an opportunity to essentially do what I sometimes call personalized parenting, to better understand your child, what they're most at risk for, and what kind of parenting strategies are going to be most important and that they'll respond best to. So by better understanding how your child is wired, you can actually tailor your parenting accordingly. So if we were together in a room, I would kind of ask by show of hands how many of you had heard of the Precision Medicine Initiative, or sometimes called personalized medicine or precision medicine. And I actually find that very few people have, but it is what all of us in the research world are talking about. There are literally billions of dollars going into the Precision Medicine Initiative. It was signed into law through a bipartisan agreement in 2016 after President Obama announced it in his State of the Union address in 2015. When does anything happen with bipartisan support anymore? And the whole idea is that we're making tremendous advances in genetics and in understanding how genetics interact with behavioral, environmental, lifestyle factors. And with all of this information, we can do better than a one-size-fits-all approach to medicine. Because the reality is, most of us still today go to our doctors when there is something wrong. We call it a healthcare system, but really it is a sick care system. And we usually don't rush right off to our doctor right when we notice a problem. We, in fact, see if it'll get better on its own, or we try to manage it on its own. And then it's only when things get worse that then we might go in. And then it is this kind of trial and error period of figuring out what might be going on, what's going to work best for you, trying different things to figure out what works. And this is incredibly costly. It's costly to the individual who's struggling. It's costly to their family. It's costly to our healthcare system. And there are really obvious parallels to parenting here too. Very often when our children start struggling, we start trying to figure out what it is, we try and manage it on our own or working with them, and then it's only as things get worse that then we think about, oh my gosh, do I need treatment? Do I need other help? And then we try and figure out, if you go into a healthcare professional, they're often trying to, figure out through behavioral or pharmaceutical interventions how best to help your child. The idea behind personalized medicine, or personalized parenting, is that our children's genes shape their behaviors and their emotions just as much as they are shaping their propensity for asthma or allergies or eyesight. And so by understanding how your child is wired, you can know what they're most at risk for, what's causing some of the challenges that you might be experiencing at home, and what parenting strategies are likely to work best for them. And that's what we're going to talk some about today. So before I jump into all of this, I have to flash back and do a quick basic biology lesson, because the reality is that it's been a while since most of us got basic genetics in high school. And the genetics that most of us got isn't the genetics that's really useful, in the sense that it's not genetics of complex outcomes like behaviors and emotions. Most of us kind of got the Punnett squares and brown eyes and blue eyes and Mendel and Peapods. So let's take a step back and think for a minute about, where do our kids' dispositions come from? So we all have 3 billion base pairs of DNA that contain the code to literally make us who we are. A lot of that code is shared, and so 99.9% of the stretch of DNA is identical between all humans, and it's coding for things like 10 fingers and 10 toes and eyes and heads and internal organs. But that 1.1% that differs is still 3 million places in our genome and all the combinations thereof. In the same way that that contributes to so many genetic differences that we can see on the outside in our hair color and our eye color and skin color and body shape and size, there are also equally interesting, I think far more interesting, differences that exist in the way our brains are wired on the inside too. And so every child is a combination of 50% DNA from biological father and 50% DNA from biological mother. But what 50% you get from each parent is totally random. It's like the flip of a coin for every single location in the genome. And so, to make this a little more concrete for a minute, if you imagine let's say, take an example like height. Height is like behavior, distributed like a bell curve, and there's actually thousands of genetic variants that are involved, each of which can increase or decrease height a little bit. But let's pretend there are just 10 genetic variants shown here. And every T copy that you have is a genetic variant that's making you taller. And every S copy is a genetic variant that's making you shorter. And so if you have two average height parents, then they have about half tall genes and half short genes, and they average out to make them an average height. So if you have two average parents, if we were all together, I would see who was brave enough to kind of, wager a guess as to what the likely height of their child is going to be. But if you're thinking about it's a coin toss every time, then you'll pretty quickly figure out that on average, that child is most likely to also be of average height. Because if you imagine that these are, let's say, marbles in a bag, blues and reds, and you're going to pick out 5 of them, on average, you'll pick out half tall, half short from dad, half tall, half short from mom, and you'll get an average height child. But not always. It's not likely, but it's possible that you can reach into that bag and get one after the other of tall genes. So you could get all talls, or you could get all shorts. You can flip a coin and get 10 tails in a row. It's not likely, but it's possible. And that is why our kids have some dispositional traits, whether it's impulsivity or anxiety or extroversion, that we can look at our kids and go, oh, that's totally me, or oh, that is totally dad. And sometimes our kids have these traits or dispositional attributes that we just look at and go, where in the world did that come from? And it's because they end up with these random mixes of what's hidden in our genomes. And so scientists like myself are actually involved in studies where we are literally scanning the entire genome, all those millions of locations that differ. And we're looking at individuals who are, say, higher on substance use problems or higher on anxiety or higher on depression, whatever we're essentially searching for genes for, where are the locations in the genome where they're more likely to carry a particular genetic variant? And we can then add those up and weight them by their effect sizes to create a genetic risk score for individuals. It's not here yet. It's still in the research lab, but it's definitely coming soon. That would allow us to sort of get a sense of our child's specific genetic makeup, but we don't even need that. So we can learn a lot about what our kids' genetic makeup is just by looking at their behavior, because the way that genes influence our kids' behavior is that they're all born with this sequence of DNA. It's unique for every one of our kids. And that influences the way the synapses form when their brain develops. So it literally influences the way that their brain is wired. Back to that, we can see lots of differences between our kids and between each other on the outside. There's just as fascinating, equally complex differences in the way our brains are wired too. And that brain wiring then influences things that we call personality or dispositions. So it's our kids' dispositions toward things like fearfulness or anxiety, or frustration or impulsivity, or sociability and extroversion. And then those traits impact how our kids interact with the world. And so we talk about three big ways that kids' genotypes influence their interactions with the world. The first is that our kids' genes, our genes too, of course, influence the responses that they evoke from their environments. And so you can see this starting from the time that they're babies. If you have a baby who's happy and loves to be held by other people, then you likely got to pass that baby off a lot. And so many people held it and smiled at it. Same thing with if you have an agreeable little toddler who'll run up and spend time with other adults, then other adults respond to that and they smile at them. And that child is learning, oh, people are friendly and they're very nice to me. If you have a child who was colicky, nobody likes holding somebody else's crying baby. Even parents, we don't like holding a crying baby after a while. Or if you have a child that maybe is more introverted or more fearful, they might have had more trouble from the time they're little interacting with others. They're kind of hiding behind your leg. And that might mean that other adults pay less attention to them. You can see how their characteristics very early on start evoking different responses from people. If you have a child that is more impulsive and is bouncing around in their chair, from the time they're in grade school, they might be getting more harsh feedback from their teachers. They're evoking responses from people based on their behavior. The second way that our kids' genes influence their interactions with the environment is the way that they respond to the environment. And so, for example, you see this in adults and whatnot too. My husband and I can walk outside on any given day and I will go, "Ooh, it's chilly." And he's like, "What are you talking about? It feels great." We have different responses to that exact same environment based on our makeup. And, or you could imagine that if you have maybe you're with your best friend and you're at a party and you meet a third person and you're kind of having a little conversation over the ham biscuits and they then go about their way and you turn to your friend and say, "Oh my gosh, isn't that person so friendly? I think they're wonderful." And the friend might say like, "Oh my gosh, I thought they were so annoying." Exact same interaction, but yet we have interpreted it differently. It felt different to us. So with our kids, the way they respond to the environment is different. You know, we might have seen this. I have two children, and one of them, a harsh look stops them in their tracks, and the other one, a harsh look barely registers. They keep plowing right on with what they're doing. The third way that our genes influence our kids' interactions with their environments is the environments that they seek out. And this, of course, becomes particularly relevant as our kids get older. So little kids can kind of influence the environments they end up in by how much they throw fits or how destructive they are in certain environments. And so, for example, if you had a really impulsive child, you might not have spent a lot of time at library reading hour if, like my child, they were running around pulling off all the books. That turns into a not fun bonding time together. But as they get older, they actually can choose. Do they want to spend their time at the library? Do they want to spend their time with one other close friend? Or do they want to be out at those parties with everybody else? As they get older and into even college and they really now have freedom, do they want to be at fraternity parties or do they want to be out at the movies? So our kids' dispositions influence the environments that they seek out and enjoy. And then, of course, what happens is that those interactions with the environment feed back to further influence kids' brain development. And it is really in this feedback loop right here that our kids, we can't change our kids' genes, but what we can change and help them with is how those genetic predispositions essentially influence their interactions with the world, how we can help them with some of those parts of their dispositions that might be more likely to get them into trouble, how they interpret some of those interactions that they might have. And then that will further feedback and create these, feedback loops of brain development. So let's talk a little bit more about how that works, because I think a key thing here is that no, we can't mold our kids from scratch. We're not going to be able, they're not little lumps of clay that we get to decide exactly, are they going to be a vase or are they going to be a plate? But their genetic dispositions are not also destiny. So you might have a child who's more impulsive or who's more at risk for substance use or mental health challenges, but it does not mean they are destined to develop problems, because genes are just part of the puzzle. And the way that we sometimes talk about this, and this is with credit to one of my close colleagues who leads the world's largest psychiatric genetic counseling clinic, and she gives the example of mental health jars. And so if we imagine that we all have a mental health jar, and when that jar gets full, that's when we are actively experiencing problems. So that's when our kids might be using drugs or other or alcohol in ways that are problematic, or experiencing depression or anxiety. The things that can make that jar fill up are genetic factors, which we're going to show here as little yellow marbles, and environmental risk factors, which we're going to show here with little orange triangles. Now, everyone has some genetic vulnerability to substance use disorders. And so I mentioned before, but all behavior is distributed like a bell curve in the population. And so that means that some individuals are at low risk, some individuals are unlucky enough to be at high risk, and then there's lots of us that fall somewhere in the middle. And so when we think about what that means with respect to genetic risk, it's really how full your jar already is. Nobody starts life, obviously, already with depression or with a substance use disorder. But how close is your jar? How close are you to developing problems, depending on the genes that you inherit? So individuals with higher genetic risk, we might think of as carrying more of those genetic risk factors. Moderate risk here, slightly less, and low risk might have a few, but a long way to go before you develop problems. And then, of course, what happens is that over time, we accumulate environmental stressors as well. And so if you have a lot of genetic risk, it might not take as many environmental stressors to essentially fill up that jar for that child to be experiencing problems. On the other hand, if you have lower genetic risk, it doesn't mean you can never develop problems. It just means there has to be a lot more environmental risk factors. So those might be things like risk factors found in peers, found in neighborhoods, found in schools, etc. But hopefully this also shows you, or allows us to start thinking about how we can either prevent or recover from substance use disorders. And so if you imagine that a full jar means someone is actively experiencing problems, you can either remove environmental risk factors, so they might still be at risk, but they're not actively experiencing problems, or we can add protective factors. And so these are things that we can do as parents, in our schools, in our communities. Things like monitoring our children, reducing their access to substances. Because every individual is going to have a unique jar comprised of their genetic risk factors and their environmental risk factors. And what is in that jar can be different for different people. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what it means to be genetically at risk for substance use disorders. What does that look like? Because there is no one genetic predisposition. There is no one gene for. There are these thousands of genetic variants that can increase or decrease risk a little bit. And so it's the kind of combination of all of them. But you don't need all of those 1,000 genetic variants. You might have different subsets that make you or your child more at risk. And so we're going to talk about what are some of those different genetic predispositions. I find that one of the biggest misconceptions about genetic influences on substance use disorders, which increasingly people understand and recognize, that yes, there is a genetic component. Some people are more likely to develop problems with alcohol or other drugs than other people. It's partly in our genes. But I find that one of the biggest misconceptions is that that means, people think that that means that if I try a drug, alcohol, opiates, nicotine, that I might carry genes which make me more likely to become physiologically dependent on that drug. There is a little bit of truth to that. So in fact, there are genes that influence how our bodies respond to a drug. And that's why, if you've ever been prescribed, for example, opiates or other prescription drugs for, say, pain after a surgery, some people are like, wow, this is amazing. Other people are like, oh, this makes me feel really nauseous. How do people become addicted to this? So there are genes that influence the way our bodies respond to a drug. Some people have genetic variants that, for example, if they drink alcohol, makes them flush. They might turn bright red. It might make them sick or nauseous. That means that they actually carry a gene which makes it harder for them to break down alcohol. And so this kind of toxic byproduct builds up to make people feel sick. Turns out if you have that gene, it's highly protective against developing problems if every time you take a drink of alcohol, it makes you very sick. That's kind of a rare exception because it's a gene that has a pretty big effect on its own. The reality is there are some genes that influence how our bodies respond to drugs, but that's just one tiny part of why some people are more at risk than others. The much bigger genetically influenced pathways are found in what we sometimes call externalizing and internalizing pathways. And that's not related to the way bodies respond to a drug, that's related to the way brains are wired. So some of our kids, some of us too, of course, have brains that are wired to be more attuned to rewards and less attuned to immediately thinking through the long-term consequences. So this externalizing risk pathway shows up in individuals who are more sensation-seeking and more risk-taking or more impulsive. These are essentially individuals or kids whose brains are wired more toward impulsivity, toward the here and now, toward what they're excited about and they want in the moment, that their brains don't immediately stop and check them and go, ooh, is this going to be a good idea for tomorrow? Or what about next week? Or if you're a teenager, gosh, I really want to become a doctor. And that means I am going to have to get into a good college and a pre-med track. And that means I need good grades and good SATs. And you know what? When the friend is showing up at your house saying, hey, let's go out to this party, that is an immediate reward. All of these consequences are very long term. Of course, we know that adolescents and where their brains are in general tends to be in a place where the parts of their brains that are more wired toward the immediate here and now reward seeking are more primed than those long-term consequences. But there's a lot of variability between kids in terms of their natural genetic dispositions toward these traits too. That is actually one of the biggest genetically influenced pathways as to why some kids are more at risk than others. And then the other genetically influenced risk pathway is found in the way that brains are wired to process anxiety and fear. And so individuals who are more genetically predisposed toward worry and toward anxiety, or maybe toward depressive thinking, as they get older and now substances become more widely available, we actually find that kids that are more disposed toward internalizing are actually less likely to use substances in adolescence, because so much of adolescent substance use is substance use that happens in the context of peers and risk taking that are more internalizing kids might be less likely to use in adolescence, but all of a sudden then once alcohol or other drugs become more widely available, historically around age 21, and then when it becomes legal in the United States at least, then what happens is they might discover, oh, this is a way to relieve my anxiety, drinking or using other drugs to cope. If they don't have good coping mechanisms in place to manage that, then substances can be used for coping purposes, which we know is associated with the development of problems. So it's actually these two pathways, externalizing and internalizing, the way brains are wired toward impulsivity or toward anxiety, that are the biggest risk factors, the biggest genetically influenced risk factors that impact why some kids are more at risk for developing problems with substances than others. And it might not feel like it right now, but bear with me. This is actually good news for us as parents, and it's good news for prevention. And that is because these dispositional traits show up early in development. And so we know that the more risk-taking, impulsive child is the one that from the time they are toddlers are dangling from the tops of trees. They're more likely to get injured, to end up in ERs, to give us parents heart attacks. We know that that child, they might be dangling from a tree at age 5, but if you fast forward a decade, they are more likely to be this child. And so one of the things that we can help with is, how do you take that risk-taking disposition and channel it into something other than this? Because there's no reason that that brain that's wired toward more sensation seeking can't also be focused toward this or toward this. And in fact, for full disclosure, this little risk taker is my little risk taker, who comes by it very honestly. His father, my brother are all fighter pilots. Who becomes fighter pilots? Risk-taking, sensation-seeking individuals. And this brings us to what I think is such an important point that I hope everyone will remember, which is that all of our kids' dispositional traits come with good and not so good. And so we know that kids who are higher on impulsivity and kind of that risk-taking, reward-seeking, they are more likely to be using substances in adolescence. But they're also more likely to be CEOs and entrepreneurs and fighter pilots. And so that same disposition can be channeled in different ways. And in fact, one of the things that I find parents frequently ask me when they're asking about their children is they'll talk to me about what they're kind of like, or maybe some challenges that they're experiencing, and they'll say, is this normal? And the thing that I tell parents is, that's not the question that you want to ask, because behavior is distributed on a bell curve, like we talked about, and that's true whether you're thinking of impulsivity or anxiety or defiant behavior or substance use. And that means that there are going to be some individuals who are very low, and it is normal to have some individuals who are going to be very high. And we clinically divide this in a kind of arbitrary way. We put in a line using symptom counts and essentially say above a particular cutoff, we're going to call that a disorder. We're going to call that ADHD or anxiety or a substance use disorder. But the reality is that kids can be struggling all along this kind of upper end of the continuum. And that can make it challenging for us as parents too. And so the question that I suggest asking is, if you're looking at your child and thinking, is this normal? Is this normal adolescent risk-taking or experimentation? That seeking out help and resources or talking to a professional can never be the wrong thing to do. Parenting is hard. The people that I know that are most willing to seek out help are other child psychologists and psychiatrists, because we realize that figuring out that fuzzy, somewhat arbitrary line, is extremely difficult. And so if that behavior is causing impairment in their relationship with you as their parents, or at school, or with their friends, if it's causing challenges in their life, then getting some extra help can never be the wrong thing to do. And that's what I also hope to help parents do with my book. So what I do in the book is essentially walk through 3 big genetically influenced dispositional styles or temperamental traits. I call them the 3 E's to make it easy to remember. So the X factor, which is extroversion. So our kids vary tremendously in how extroverted or introverted they naturally are. We talk about that a lot in adults, but we don't talk about it as much in our kids. And I think that's a problem because from the time they're little, we might be trying to put them into activities that are not a great fit for their disposition. And that might be causing some of, when they're little, temper tantrums. Or if you can imagine, if you have an adolescent who's maybe naturally more introverted, and you're a more extroverted parent, I fall into this category, and my son is in the much more introverted, then if we're not careful, what we could end up doing is putting pressure on our kids. Why don't you have more friends? Don't you want to go out more? Don't you want to spend more time with people? Join more clubs. Don't you want to be a part of more sports? Because that might be what's right for us, but not necessarily what's right for our kids. And so that can essentially create some challenges both in our relationships with our kids, but in also how they see themselves. It can affect their self-concept and feeling whether they're enough or something is wrong with them. Extroversion, we also know, is associated with greater obviously wanting to be around peer groups, and we know that risk-taking and substance use is more likely to happen in peer groups. So kids who are more extroverted are also more likely to be engaging in substance use in adolescence and emerging adulthood. The second big E is emotionality, or the M factor. These are kids who from the time they're little might have strong feelings, and we sometimes might think of this as feelings that seem out of proportion with the situation. So that can manifest as anxiety or temper tantrums when they're little, or in adolescence, maybe fear going places or trying new things, things of that sort. Some kids are more prone to being more highly emotional than others. And these are the kids that if we don't give them good strategies to help them manage that anxiety, then they can be at risk for elevated substance use and substance use problems actually later in life once they leave home. The last big dimension is effortful control, or what we sometimes colloquially call self-control or impulsivity. Some kids, as we are talking about, are higher on this characteristic naturally. These are the kids that have brains that are wired more toward risk-taking and sensation-seeking. And we want to think about how we can essentially give them strategies to help them think about long-term consequences and things that maybe don't naturally occur to their brains, so that they are not making choices that could, especially as they're moving into adolescence and emerging adulthood, that could derail what's really important to them. And so what I do in my book is there's surveys to essentially gauge where your children fall on these big dimensions. And then there's information about what kids with different dispositions really need from their parents and what kind of parenting strategies are important to help your kids maybe learn some skills that don't come to them naturally and prevent some of these challenging behaviors. There's also information in there about navigating co-parenting, because of course it's not just kids who have dispositions, we do as well. And so sometimes the fit between our dispositions and our kids, as we talked a little bit about, might be a match, but it might be a mismatch. And of course, our partners very often have a different disposition. Their brain is wired to operate in a different way. So they might perceive kids' behavior as different in terms of how worrisome or how problematic it is. That's often a source of conflict between partners or spouses or co-parents. And so there's information about kind of how to navigate some of those differences, as well as how to work with teachers, coaches, other caregivers, and this question of defining kind of normal behavior versus behavioral disorders, and sort of when to, I sometimes call it when to worry, what to do about it, some of the logistics of that. So if you're interested, there's really kind of, as Michelle was mentioning, my book is intended to be, it's an easy read for parents. One of my favorite comments that I got from a friend who got one of the early copies of the book, and they were reading it, and they came up to me and they said, I really like your book. And they sounded so surprised that I kind of laughed and said, you seem really surprised by that. And they said, well, I just thought it would be more sciencey, but it just feels like we're having a cup of coffee and talking together about our kids. And so it's intended to be kind of really approachable in terms of helping you understand your child and thinking about what that can mean for really helping them reach their greatest potential and avoid potential pitfalls that they might be naturally disposed to. I also mentioned that we are really at the cusp of being able to give specific genetic feedback. Genetics alone will only ever be part of the story, but we know a lot now about both what are the specific genes that are involved in why some kids are more at risk, and what are the behavioral and environmental factors that predict which kids are more at risk. And we talked about some of those today. But in my research center, what we're actually doing is building out a platform in which we can have individuals complete surveys, and then you do a kind of spit in a tube to get the genetic piece. And we integrate all of that using research algorithms. You hear a lot about machine learning and AI. So we essentially integrate that to be able to give people more personalized risk information and then connect them to resources tailored to them. So if the QR code there, if you want to point your phone at the screen, is essentially if you are interested to sign up through the Research Center website, and then as that becomes available, we'll be sending out more information. Because the piece that I really want us all to remember is that some of our kids are more at risk than others, but none of them are destined to develop problems. And when we know what are the risk factors, what are the marbles, those genetic and environmental factors that are in our kids' jars. So do you have a child that is wired more toward impulsivity, or maybe toward anxiety proneness? Or if you have substance use challenges in your family, then you know that they might also carry potentially some of that physiological response to drugs risk factors too. If you can think about what are the risk factors that your child might carry, and then we talked previously about some of the environmental factors that put kids more at risk. So when there's more access to alcohol, when there are more peers who are using and there's kind of more social acceptance of alcohol. So those are some of the things that can be the environmental risk factors. Or as our kids get older, do they have positive, supportive peer groups? Do we monitor them and ask them where they're going or who they're with? If we are a school or a community member, do we have supports in place to essentially, work with kids who might be struggling to get them help, rather than essentially making them feel worse about themselves, which can further perpetuate cycles? So thinking about, are there ways that we can reduce the environmental factors, identify the genetic factors that our kids might carry, and then put in place more of these protective factors? And last time I pointed you toward some of the resources that are available on the NIAAA, National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism website, and NIDA, National Institute of Drug Abuse. These are the bodies of the National Institutes of Health that fund virtually all of the research that's done in these areas. They fund virtually all of my work. And so you can know that the information that you can get there is going to be evidence-based. And they've put together a lot of materials that are more outward facing toward parents. In addition, I work on one of the largest studies of the genetics of alcohol use disorders. It's called COGA, the Collaborative Study on the Genetics of Alcohol. And we have a website, cogastudy.org, in which we got some funding from the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism to work with essentially individuals who do graphic design and videography to put some of our latest research findings into videos and kind of user-friendly blogs and information that are intended for lay audiences to better understand genetic risk for substance use outcomes. So I might also point you toward that. And then finally, as not only a researcher, but also a parent, I care a lot about how to get this information to the public. And so on this slide here, you will see that at my website, danielledick.com, I put a whole series of different resources, from videos to blogs that I write on Medium and Psychology Today. And so you can find a variety of resources that are there and that I put out for other parents, so that research doesn't just live in scientific journals and in the minds of researchers, but can actually get to you all, the people who can use it. So with that, I will stop, and I am happy to take your questions.
So much for all the insight and information you brought to us, Dr. Danielle Dick. I'm going to go through a couple of points about Operation Parent while we get a few more questions in the queue, and let folks know what we're up to. So we'd like for you to take a look at our elementary edition and know that we cover all substance use issues that your teen might face in both our elementary as well as our middle and high. If you already have Operation Parent handbooks, you can go to the pages listed there and prime yourself up for some additional conversations with your teen, your child or your teen this evening. And you can use the QR code there to get some additional information. As we spoke about in the beginning, hope is at the core of everything that we do at Operation Parent, and we know that our handbooks save lives. They have saved lives, and we're committed to reaching more parents, and that is why we offer free shipping as well as free webinars for parents to stay ahead of the curve and just get as much information possible. And Dr. Danielle, when you were talking about the resources up on your website, I cannot encourage families to go there more and poke around and just get some more information and some more ways to learn more about how to prevent substance use. If you would like to help us spread that mission of hope, you can go to operationparent.org/shop, and you're going to see our parent handbooks are available there. They are extremely affordable. They will help you talk with your teen about tough topics as listed here: alcohol, marijuana, vaping, and of course, mental health. There are several editions that you can choose from, just so you know: middle and high, elementary, Spanish, as well as Christian. If you purchased a handbook already, we do a graceful ask that you might recommend those handbooks to a close family member or friend so that you can enhance the protective factors around your family. We're also encouraging you, if you're brand new to here, not to wait to purchase a handbook because it's going to be one of your most well-used and valuable resources. And then if you pair that with Dr. Danielle's book as well, you're ready for just about anything that might come your way. We've also developed a new prevention education program that you can use at your middle schools. Our community advocates, Allie and Carol, are available to talk with you more about how this is being used across the country. But if I could put it in my own words, it gives you an opportunity to introduce students to drug vocabulary, and then also practice their refusal skills so that they are just ramping up. They're more knowledgeable, and they also have lots of tricks up their sleeve to refuse any type of substance or drugs. It's very interactive. It's very fun. It's all prepackaged for you. And so you can tap on the QR code there and also email Allie and Carol to learn more about the TNT program. If you happen to be local, which we do have lots of local folks on with us, we want to let you know we have a new event coming up here in just a little bit. It's our fundraiser, our trivia night. It's going to be a lively event that brings people together for fun and very friendly competition. Participants will test their knowledge across diverse topics, and we're going to foster a great sense of community at that event. If you're not local and you're so moved to still donate to our organization to help us keep these webinars free, as well as expand our programs and help us reach over 200,000 families even more quickly than what we dream of, there's lots of opportunities on our website to donate. And then next up, we want to remind you that you are eligible for being here on the webinar live with us today for Dr. Danielle's book giveaway, as well as we're going to pair that with an Operation Parent Handbook. So you need to enter your name and your email address and your mailing address, all three of those things, in the question section to be entered to win one of those 2 copies of the books. And then next up, we've got Danielle's business card here that we highly encourage you to take a picture of the business card and follow her on her social platforms. She's doing great things on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. I didn't see Twitter as much, but I'm not sure if you're super active there, but I did see the 3 I mentioned first. But all of those, follow her everywhere you can.
I'm on Twitter. I miss that little blue bird though.
Yeah, yes. And then we also invite you to do the same on our end. All of our social media handles are under Operation Parents across all of our platforms, and you can share and continue to share about Operation Parent and tag us. We would love it if you let us know how you're utilizing our webinars, handbooks, or TNT in your community up on our social media platforms. And then we've got some great questions lined up for you. I've got a few that I pulled out early, so we'll get started with those. So one parent asked, do you think that there's an age when it's too late to add protective factors or remove environmental factors for your teens?
It's never too late and it's never too early. So I say that in the sense that, you know, the it's never too late is, of course, it can be challenging when teens are already experiencing problems in particular. And I know that's often the time that I will find parents feel most despondent about, I've tried, it doesn't seem to be getting better. And, the thing that I remind those parents is that, recovery, if your teen is already experiencing challenges, that recovery is a process. And it's a process that takes time in the same way that all kinds of complex health outcomes are. And so if someone, has cardiovascular disease, they don't just suddenly the next day usually change their diet and start working out every day and everything is better. It's changing our behavior and our health related outcomes is really something that takes time. So it is never too late. And I have to say, one of my favorite things is that I do work with a lot of recovery communities, and I work with our collegiate recovery communities and our teens who are in recovery. And so, never lose hope if you have a teen who is experiencing challenges already. It is also never too late, even if sometimes I'll have parents ask me, well, gosh, I didn't establish all these rules and boundaries, or, maybe earlier on I did allow my kids access to alcohol in the home because I thought it would be safer if they did it at home than somewhere else. And now I'm learning more and I feel like maybe I did the wrong thing or I want to change course. Can I do that midway? And, the thing I say is, Absolutely. It is never too late to course correct or to, implement new rules. Now, we also all know, I have a teenager, how well that works, right? It doesn't go over well usually, which is why the other piece of the puzzle, and for those of you that were at my previous webinar, we talked a lot about kind of talking to your kids and how to do that and whatnot. But, you know, as your kids are teenagers, increasingly developing a relationship where you are asking them, how are they feeling about things, what's going on with them in terms of what they're seeing at school, why they want to use, maybe why they are using, and helping them think through, okay, why is that? If you lay the groundwork, having those conversations with your teens, then if you learn something new, like, oh, wow, I'm making this up, but I thought e-cigarettes were going to be better because they were safer. They didn't have nicotine, but now I know that they do. And so, I really want to talk to you about this. Those are conversations that you absolutely want to have with your child. Change is hard for everyone, including teenagers, but it is never too late. And as the parent, you also always have the authority, right? Especially when your child is there and under your roof and living with you, you really want to support their health and development. That's your time to do that best. And so absolutely never too late. And the flip side of that is, if you have younger children, then it's also never too early. So kids usually start asking about alcohol and other drugs pretty early because they'll see it in the media, or they'll see you having a glass of wine and say, oh, can I try that? And so talking to them about, no, these are grown-up, beverages, and only grown-ups can have this. And then as they get a little bit older, they'll say, why? Well, because it affects grown-ups' brains differently than it affects kids' brains, and it's not good for kid brains. And I did a Q&A with Melinda Wenner Moyer. You can actually find that on my website, where we talk about how to talk to your kids about alcohol and other drugs and some strategies for that.
That's excellent. And I love the hope that you give us if something doesn't work, or it's not well received on the front end by the teenager. You got to just keep at it and then reroute if something's not working. I mean, that we have to do that all the time as parents, say that we messed up, we're sorry, let's start again, it's a new day. And like you said, recovery is hard. There's a lot of layers, and if just encouraging, like, just not give up and keep continuing to find the best match in terms of like therapists that could help. If one uh, approach doesn't work, to not stop, keep trying. Every day is a new day, and um, you need a lot of support. So don't stop asking or seeking it. Um, there's just so many layers, and it's complicated, and substances are really strong today. It's not going to be easy, but you do have a lot of us that are hoping to help and support. Um, I love that. I love it, that our teens aren't always going to like when we reroute, but we've learned something new every day too that makes us maybe want to reroute. What about layering in the family history? So everything you taught us today about how brains might be wired for impulsivity or anxiety or this or that, but then you also know for sure in your family tree, which in my family tree, we have a strong alcohol addiction. So what would your advice be with that?
So if you know nothing else, right, the single biggest predictor or question you would ask to try and get a sense of a child's genetic predisposition would be, do you have a family history? So because we know that a family history of alcohol or other drug problems both can be associated with increased genetic risk, because kids get a combination of biological parents, and then also sometimes there's increased environmental risk as well too, because if you had a parent who struggled with substance use disorder, then they might not have been able to be there to put in place boundaries or other kinds of things, and so it can lead to challenging environments in addition to potentially genetic risk. So if you have genetic risk in your family tree, one of the things that, again, parents frequently ask me is, should I tell my child about that? And I say, Absolutely. So, in the same way that if there was a history of heart attacks in your family, you would tell your child, hey, there's cardiovascular disease in our family, and that means that you are probably more at risk. So, you might not be able to eat foods, or you might have to change your exercise, or you might have to take certain medications as you get older because unfortunately we carry this genetic risk in our family. It's also true with substances. You can have a very similar conversation. And the fact that we don't even naturally think to do that clearly speaks to the fact that there's still stigma surrounding this in our society. And so it's up to us. We can break that down. And so talking to kids about, hey, there's a family history of alcohol or other drug problems. That means that you might not be able to drink in the same way that your friends can without developing problems. You might be more likely. Now, you can also get a sense. So part of it is your child is not going to know if they carry that physiological risk piece unless they try substances. But as I mentioned, the good news is that some of that other family history genetic risk shows up in these behavioral characteristics that can give you a sense of, is my child carrying some of that genetic risk? Or maybe if you have a highly impulsive child, right, maybe a lot of that genetic risk. Or if you have a child that's more predisposed toward anxiety, that's kind of another form of that genetic risk. And the piece I didn't mention, but I want to make sure I say is, those are not mutually exclusive paths, of course. You know, we could all carry some risk or lots of risk across lots of those areas. And sometimes when there is a history of substance use problems in a family, there might be risk across multiple of those pathways. And so you want to have those conversations with your kids. And if they're carrying some of those risk factors, you want to talk with them about that too, and how, you know, that it might potentially lead them into problems. So what are some ways that we can put in place some strategies? Because if you have that impulsive teenager, you know, you might be at a party one day and somebody's going to hand you a beer or a drug, and it might seem really fun, and you know, like, you know that you like to jump on those fun things. So what are some things that we can put in place in helping them with strategies that otherwise, if you haven't had those conversations, that's kind of a nice way parents can help again with those protective strategies. Because if you haven't had all those conversations and whatnot, then your impulsive child might just be like, yeah, seems great, let's try it. So that's kind of a long way of saying, yes, you want to think about family history. It can show up in some of these risk pathways, but you also should more generally talk to your kids about if there's family risk as well.
It's a beautiful way to say it, and you gave us like so many ideas on how to practice the refusal skills, you know, because it's maybe not natural for them. And so if they've got a lot of ways and approaches in their back pocket, in the back of their mind, I think one of the things you like to say too is, you know, go up, you can blame it on me, blame it fully on your mom, you know.
Absolutely. I tell my son that, and uh, you know, we know that giving kids tools in their toolkit so that they are ready when they are inevitably, usually in adolescence, approached with alcohol or other drugs, it makes it far more likely that they will actually make a good choice. In the same way that, you know, you don't want to walk into a job interview and all of a sudden if they ask you a question that you've never thought of, you're more likely to be like, Whereas if you've thought through your answer, you can like just pull that right out of memory. And so we want to give our kids those strategies that when they're put on the spot like that, they can pull those out of memory. And if you've talked with them and practiced with them, and it doesn't have to be a one and done conversation, it shouldn't be a one and done conversation, but things like with my son, I always say, you know, you can say, oh my gosh, my mom would kill me and I cannot, you know, like, I don't want to be grounded for the whole rest of my high school career kind of thing. So yes, using
Perfect.
you as a scapegoat can be, and you know, one of the things you can do for your kids if they don't feel comfortable using some of those other strategies
That's
themselves.
right. 100%. Use away. Use me as a scapegoat. Totally comfortable with that. Okay, so I have one final question for you. And this parent asked, the externalizing versus internalizing children, um, do you think one of these are more difficult to protect from addiction than the other? Or can you maybe tell us a little bit about what you think of each, internalizing and externalizing?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we know from the research is that externalizing and that sort of behavioral regulation pathway is one of the biggest genetically influenced pathways. So kids who are more primed toward reward, toward risk taking, that tends to show up earlier in adolescence. So that tends to be associated with more risky behavior, with experimentation, with using in risky ways, right? Like binge drinking, experimenting with other drugs, which of course can be exceedingly dangerous now that so much of the drug supply is contaminated with fentanyl and other kinds of things. And so we know that the biggest risk factor and the biggest way that genetic dispositions are influencing adolescent and emerging adult substance use problems is via that pathway. So if you're just going to look at a population level, I would say behavioral regulation is the biggest genetically influenced risk factors. But internalizing, though it affects a smaller, it's more inconsistently related to substance use problems because, of course, there are many people that can struggle with anxiety and depression that don't turn to alcohol or other drugs to self-medicate. That it might still be causing challenges in their life, and you still want to, if you have a child who has some of these challenges, work with them on skills to help them learn to manage this, and where indicated, potentially other medications and kinds of things to manage anxiety and depression. But we know that if you can work with your teens, they are less likely to develop problems because the individuals who develop substance use problems through that internalizing pathway are more likely to develop problems later. So externalizers are more likely to develop problems in the teenage years or early 20s. Internalizers are more likely to develop problems in the later 20s and beyond because they're less likely to actually be, most adolescents are not using on their own, right? It would be hard to access alcohol. It tends to be more social. Depression, anxiety tend to manifest with more kind of turning inward. Not to say that that's always the case, of course, but overall, fewer kids with depression and anxiety start using in risky ways in adolescence and in college. It tends to be when they're then on their own, where they have, easier access to alcohol. Now they're maybe adults living alone and they discover, oh, I can have a few drinks before I go out and it makes me feel better. Or, gosh, I have been feeling anxious all day and I can have a bottle of wine and that goes away. And so those are the kids who are more likely to develop problems later. So it's a smaller percentage of them. It happens later, but when individuals develop problems through that route, they are more likely to persist. Whereas our externalizing kids, they are more likely to mature out of it too, right? They might engage in a lot of risky behavior, but then once kind of other adult responsibilities come online, not always, of course, but more of them mature out than of the kids who start using to cope. So hopefully that helps differentiate a little bit. There's slightly different pathways that these kids kind of take toward developing problems. So things for
Sure.
parents to be aware of.
Externalizing earlier, internalizing later onset. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
got it. That's a good picture for us to keep in our head as we're working on things in our own homes. And then I was remiss in asking, one parent asked about your insight or your thoughts about a child who may have ADHD. Do you find, I know there are a lot of children with ADHD today, do you find that to be an added layer of risk, or what would your thoughts be there?
Yeah, I'm so glad that you asked that. So that same genetic disposition toward impulsivity and behavioral regulation that we know influences substance use problems a little bit later also shows up earlier as ADHD is kind of one of those manifestations. So we do know that kids who have ADHD are more at risk because they're carrying that underlying disposition toward more behavioral dysregulation that as they get a little bit older and substances come online tends to then start showing up as substance use problems. So they are more at risk. But the other thing, interestingly, that research shows is that when kids have appropriate ADHD medications and other kind of behavioral strategies that are in place. So when you're managing those ADHD symptoms, it actually reduces the likelihood that they will also develop substance use problems. So this again speaks to that prevention piece, that essentially by managing some of these kids' challenging behaviors and these early symptoms that are related to substance use early on, whether that is in ADHD or in oppositional defiant disorder or conduct problems, kind of those are other manifestations of this sort of, dysregulation that can also show up in kids who maybe have more aggression or anger too. All of those kind of early behavior problems we know put kids at higher rate for substance use. But if we manage them and we put in place strategies and get them help for that earlier, it reduces the likelihood of developing substance use problems. And parallel for the anxiety piece too. If we can manage those symptoms in kids early on, it makes it much less likely that they'll go on and develop substance use problems.
Outstanding. And there is the hope that we will close our afternoon on, that, like you said, the DNA is not the destiny. There's lots of things that you can do to just be aware and work with your teen and keep learning. So thank you so much for your positive, upbeat advice and your enthusiasm for in studying genes and helping us put all the pieces together as parents, and just continue to learn and grow. We thank you so much for your knowledge, your time, your talent, and everything. So thank you so much.
Well, thanks
And
for having me. Good to
we'll
be
talk
here.
soon. Okay, thanks. Bye-bye, Dr. Dick.
Bye.